right, so in this video, we're going to be talking about casing the layout. Casing the layout is an extremely important aspect of dealing that a lot of people don't pay as much attention to as they really should. So most of the issues that you run into, I would say, it can be resolved before you even deal your first card. We always want to look for problems before we start dealing at all. So let's start with, once you approach the table, you're going to clap in, introduce yourself to the players. The first thing you probably want to do is you want to make sure what the table minimums and maximums are. So every table is going to have a minimum or a maximum, should have both, should have both of them on your table in some form or fashion. You want to make sure that all the bets are currently placed are going to be within those limits. We're going to get into a little bit more details on that, but we just want to make sure that we're aware of what the table limits are at the time. Next thing we want to talk about is pay ratios. So some blackjack tables are 6-to-5 pay ratios and some blackjack tables are 3-to-2. There's also some blackjack variants like Change It or Super Fun 21, Free Bet. There's all these other variations and their pay ratios are very different. The rules are very different as well. So you want to make sure that you're on a blackjack variant that you know, and obviously if you don't know that game, talk to your floor person. But you really want to make sure that you know what the pay ratio is of your game, and it will usually say it above where it says dealer must hit soft 17. It'll usually say blackjacks pay 3-to-2 or 6-to-5 or something along those lines. Or you'll probably have a placard similar to the minimum maximum limit that'll also say what the pay ratio of that table is. Now, assuming that you're dealing blackjack, we also want to make sure that we know what our rules are as far as the dealer's hand. So as far as our cards for the dealer. Some casinos, you'll stand on all 17s, but the more common one is that the dealer will hit soft 17. So it's usually going to be listed on the table itself. It'll say dealer must hit soft 17 or dealer stands on all 17s, something along those lines. This is important to pay attention to, especially once you go to high limit, because high limit is usually the one where the dealer will stand on all 17s. So the next most overlooked part is making sure that once you get into your table, you understand your game, you know the pay ratio, you know what game you're dealing, you need to make sure that your rack is in order itself. Sometimes dealers are not as neat as others, and they'll just leave the table and not care how much or how destroyed their rack is. And you don't want to be blamed for how jacked up that rack is because it's your responsibility now that you're on the table. So before you deal, make sure that your rack is in order, make it look nice and pretty and easy to read for your floor person. That way they can come by, read it, and leave, and they don't have to tell you to fix your rack. Next thing we're going to talk about is all players being here. Sometimes players will place a bet, and maybe they get pulled away by their wife or something along those lines, and they forget that they placed a bet, but you're ready to go, you're ready to deal, and maybe that person had to run to the bathroom and they forgot to pull their bet back. So we don't want to deal to a bet that has no person there. So if we do run into that situation, all you're going to do is go hand up or palm up. That way you can show the camera that your hand is empty, and we're going to push that bet off of the bet spot. Just like that. That way we can show that our hand is clear and we can remove that bet from the bet spot, and then we can continue to deal our game. So we want to also make sure that we scan every single bet that's on the table to ensure that every bet is properly placed, but also making sure that the higher denomination check is closer to the table itself. The reason for that is that people can do something called pinching or dragging, and if they do that, that means they're taking money from their bet when they're not allowed to. And if they take it from the top, that usually means they're going to grab a higher denomination if the higher denomination happens to be on top. So if they do happen to get away with something, we'd rather it be a smaller denomination than anything. So in this example, we have a green $25 check sitting on top of red $5 checks. This is not proper. If we see this, we'll ask the player to fix their bet. And obviously, if the player is too distracted to do so, or they say that it's okay if we can fix it, we'll just make sure that we clear our hands and we'll fix it ourselves and then clear our hands. Just remember the rule, clear, touch, clear, just like this. Pretty easy. Just make sure that the player is okay with you touching their money before you do so. Some players are very superstitious and they think that if you touch it, you're going to rub off your bad luck on their checks, and then they're going to lose and they blame it on you. They won't blame themselves, they'll just blame it on you. You're the easiest target. Now, sometimes we have players that want to play multiple hands, meaning that they're going to essentially play multiple spots on one table and acting like multiple players. This is fine in most places. However, always check with your your casino procedures and if they allow this on whatever game you happen to be dealing. But what we generally follow is this simple rule that obviously if the player wants to bet a single spot, then they have to at least play the table minimum. But if the player chooses that they want to bet 2 spots, just like this, that means that each spot must be at least double the table minimum. Meaning if the table minimum is $5 and they want to play 2 spots, that means that there has to be at least 10 on each hand. Now, if the player chooses that they want to bet 3 spots, the rule is it has to be each spot at least 5 times the table minimum, just like this. I don't know if you guys can see it on that side, but the player's playing 3 hands, and they have $25 on that hand as well. So each spot must be at least 5 times the table minimum. So if the table minimum is $5, 5 times 5 is 25. So they're good there. Now they're allowed to play. But then we have some people who want to do 4 hands. So general rule is 4 or more, call your floor. That's the general rule. However, every casino's policy on this is different. So what I would encourage you to do is once you start dealing at your casino, and then a player wants to play 2 hands, just double check with your floor person what the casino's policies are, or if you get the dealer handbook, it should tell you in there if this is allowed and what the limits would be if that is the case. Sometimes players are distracted and they're maybe a little drunk and they end up placing bets, but it's not really in the bet spot like it's supposed to. If this is the case, yet again, try to refrain from touching that bet yourself and ask the player if they can center their bet within their bet spot. We don't want to move it for them unless we get their permission because we don't want them to have a bad hand or they lose the bet. They decide to make an argument, they look at cameras, and the cameras see us move their bet into that bet spot. And then it looks like we place that bet for them. And obviously to keep the players happy, they would side with the player. So it's always in our best interest to make sure that the player fixes their bet before we do. So if I saw this, I would ask the player, I'm sorry, could you just move that a little bit more in the center of the bet so there's no confusion? And usually they have no problem just moving it over. If the player is a little distracted and they say, yeah, I'm still in the hand, but maybe they're grabbing a drink from the cocktail waitress or something like that, then we're just gonna go palm up and we'll just nudge it into that bet spot. We always wanna do it palm up so that way the camera sees that we have nothing in our hands and we're not adding money to the bet, we're not stealing anything, something like that. So just move it in the center of that bet spot after you get confirmation with your player if they are not able to move it themselves for whatever reason. Now this one we're going to be talking about is black action and purple action. So if a player chooses that they want to bet black, which is a $100 check, just like you can see here, and purple, which is a $500 check, like you can see here, black and purple, the floor is always keeping track of how much black and purple is in your rack at all times. So if a player decides to bet black, or if you have a black that is leaving your rack because a player requested it for any reason, we always want to make sure that we make a call to floor. So in this event, the first time that I see either black or purple from that particular player, I'm going to make the announcement black action or purple action, which are both approval calls. And if you guys don't know already, an approval call is a call made to floor just to make sure that we let them know that something is going on and we cannot proceed without approval from them, from floor, all right? So I'd say black action, purple action, and then wait for my approval. If floor does not respond, I'm going to continue to say the call again, just a little bit louder. Just do not look away from the table to try to locate floor, because now you're not paying attention to your rack, you're not paying attention to your game. All you gotta do is just yell at your players a little bit more. That's what you gotta do. Unfortunately, it's what you gotta do. Now, if the player continues to bet black hand after hand after hand, or purple, same case, we only have to make that call of black action or purple action the first time that we see that color on that player's bet spot. However, if they break that action, so let's say they do black for 3 hands in a row, then they go to green, and then they go back to black. Now we have to call black action again. Purple action is the same thing. As long as they continue to do it, we only had to do it for that first time, but once they break it and come back, we gotta make the call again. There are some players that are actually aware of this and they want to do it on purpose. They want you to constantly say black action. So they'll constantly bet black and then go to green and then black and then go to green and then black and continue just because they want to keep hearing you say it. This is a really important call. And just remember that black action or purple action is approval. We cannot deal until floor tells us to do so. One of the ones that we really got to pay attention to as well is bets that are below the minimum. So obviously here, as discussed earlier, the table minimum is $5. But sometimes we have players who decide to put $3 or $4 or $1. Sometimes they'll do that. We have to make sure that we pay attention to how much they're betting. So this is a big part of casing our layout, is making sure we look at every single bet for any of these problems. And bets that are below the minimum is also a fairly common issue. So in this example, I see this player that they only have a $2 bet. So I'm going to ask them, hey, I'm sorry, but table minimum is $5. I'm going to need at least $3 more there, or if you could put a red on there, that'd be totally fine. And then either if the player doesn't have the ability to meet the minimum requirement, they are not allowed to play at this table, and you'll have to ask them to leave. If they can make the bet, then they can make the bet. So let's say the player decided that they wanted to exchange those for a red, meeting the minimum requirement. Now we're good to go. I'm just going to move on to the next player and continue to case my layout before that first card comes out. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about is bets that are over the limit. So in this example, table maximum is 1,000. However, we have a player here who is placing a bet that is over $1,000. If the player happens to make a bet that meets or exceeds that table limit, we have to make the approval call, checks play to the table limit. And it's approval, meaning we cannot continue until floor responds and tells us what to do. When a player places more than the table maximum, I see a lot of newer dealers, they like to grab the money and cut it out, and then they hand back what's too much. This is more of a newbie move because players who bet this type of action, they don't want you touching their bet. It's going to be seen as bad luck, and we don't want to do that. So all we're going to do is make our call, get our approval, and then ignore the bet and continue dealing like normal. As far as how to handle that type of bet, we'll discuss that another time. So as a repeat, I see this bet. All I'm going to say is checks play to the table limit. If floor doesn't respond, I'm just going to say it again because I cannot deal without approval. If floor says, yeah, go ahead, I'm going to ignore the bet. I'm going to continue. Floor understands that this bet is past the limit. They will not make me fix it so that way it's the limit or less. We just leave it, and we will only take or pay up to that table limit. That is it. The only exception is if there's a 3-2 or 6-5 that we have to pay. We will only pay 3-2 or 6-5, imagining we only see $1,000 on that bet. So 6-5, we would pay $1,200. 3-2, we would pay $1,500. And that's about it.